Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and in this video I'll be discussing sex offenders and mental disorders. First, I wanted to point out that in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, here's a pocket guide, there are several areas in the paraphilic disorders section, and they are described not so much in legal terms, but in clinical terms. In other words, symptoms of what would be considered a mental disorder. But in many cases, those that have these disorders may engage in criminal behavior. Not necessarily. It's certainly possible for people to be diagnosed with paraphilic disorder and not engage in any criminal activity. But sometimes there is that relationship. And so I think that's important to recognize. Just to mention what they are, and then I'll go over some of those in a little bit more detail, but the disorders are voyeuristic, exhibitionistic, frauderistic, sexual masochism, sexual sadism, pedophilic, fetishistic, transvestic, and other specified paraphilic disorders and unspecified paraphilic disorders. So you have some major ones that are more common that you see in mental health settings, and then you have other ones that you can note that you may find in working in the criminal justice system. Basically, a paraphilia involves having a sexual response to an unusual stimulus. As I mentioned, it may be legal or illegal depending on the actual behavior, the location that it takes place, whether consent is given or not, the age of the participants, and so on. So there's a lot of different factors that that would go into the determination if a law had been broken. So the other thing I think that's real important to remember as well when you're dealing with paraphilia is that it's common to see comorbidity or multiple mental disorders. So you may have someone with a paraphilia and then also another mental disorder, whether it's substance abuse related disorder or depression, and so there's they can have multiple, 3, 4, and so that's always important to recognize. So we need to look at the relationships between the disorders. That's important to do, and we need to assess the intensity, the duration, the frequency, and the severity of the disorders. So in other words, we're not, you can use the DSM-5 if you're a mental health professional, and you can say the person, has or doesn't have this particular disorder, but if the person has the disorder, there's different dimensions of it, that we know that there's different severity, that, everyone who's diagnosed with, depression doesn't look the same. And that's the same with paraphilic disorders. We also need to recognize the limitations in risk assessments of paraphilias. The media has probably added to a lot of confusion. Probably see the worst cases on that we read about in social media, on news programs, in court cases that are televised, and so that may skew a bias toward a particular way of viewing mental disorders and crime. And obviously talk shows do not represent what we see out there in the clinical and criminal justice settings. And in addition, there's always going to be some political dimensions related to disorders or behaviors. But we do have a lot of research, a lot of theory to help guide policy in these situations. And we should also remember that what is considered deviant or immoral is not necessarily a sex crime or a mental disorder, and this can vary, across cultures. Okay, let me mention a few of those disorders. You're probably very familiar with them, but I think it's important to make sure we have some working definitions. I'm not going to get into the clinical aspects of them at this point, but frotteurism is rubbing one's genitals against people without their consent for sexual arousal purposes. For example, someone may ride subway trains and rub their genitals against others that are in the train, and then pretend that it was an accident, even though it was purposeful behavior. Sadism involves becoming sexually aroused by sexual fantasies or behaviors that humiliate, physically harm, or dominate another. But it's important to note that this would not be considered a mental disorder if both parties were consenting adults who felt fine about their behavior. So that's important to recognize. And with masochism, that's characterized by becoming sexually aroused by sexual fantasies or behaviors of being physically harmed or humiliated or dominated by another. And the same holds there regarding it would not be considered a mental disorder if both parties were consenting adults who felt fine about their behavior. So there's a difference between those that are doing sadomasochistic behaviors as part of entertainment and they don't feel bad about it, it's not causing problems in their life, versus those where it is creating distress and problems in their life. A fetish consists of having sexual fantasies or engaging in sexual behaviors revolving around an object such as a shoe or underwear. Some also include body parts or objects in their use of the term, such as a shoe or a foot fetish. And sometimes we'll see, as this relates to criminal justice work, that a criminal act occurs that's related to the fetish. For example, in our clinic, we saw, cases like that. But for example, a teenager broke into a neighbor's home and stole, a bunch of the women's underwear. And the teenager had a underwear fetish, female underwear fetish. Instead of going to Amazon.com and ordering, which he could have done legally, he broke into the neighbor's house, which is a crime, and so he committed the crime as part of his fetish. Voyeurism is having sexual fantasies or engaging in behavior for sexual arousal while watching unsuspecting people engage in sexual interactions or undressing. And we've seen those, of course, in clinical practice as well, those that are looking in windows and get caught. And again, criminal behavior there. Exhibitionism is displaying one's genitals to others for sexual arousal purposes without their consent. And we've seen, of course, cases like that in our clinic where, for example, we had a man who exposed himself through his gym shorts to unsuspecting teenagers that would walk by in a public park, and he was obviously arrested for exhibitionism. So he had committed a crime, but he also had a mental disorder. Pedophilia, which I'll discuss later, is characterized by having sexual fantasies about children or engaging in sexual behavior with children, and the person has a primary sexual orientation toward prepubescent children. In another video where I discuss pedophilia in more detail, we'll differentiate how that occurs with pedophilia versus someone who engages in child sexual abuse but's not necessarily a pedophile. Other behaviors may be of interest to clinicians, researchers, or criminal justice investigators, or those working in corrections or in the legal system would include the many combinations of sexual deviations that people have. And there's just books written about that. There's all kinds of situations. When I worked in mental health clinic, I saw a lot of different cases that involved sexual behaviors that were illegal or related to different mental disorders. So I can remember getting calls from the state attorney's office with cases where they just didn't know what to do. It's like, hey, I have this case, what do I do? And often the recommendation, if the person wasn't at risk to themselves or others, was counseling at a specialized counseling center for that type of behavior. So it's often important to conduct a thorough assessment. Now, you're doing probably criminal investigations, so you still want to find out all the the details, recognizing that there's probably a lot more going on than what is initially reported. For example, the teenager who broke into the neighbor's house had admitted to breaking into not a lot, but several other houses in the neighborhood over the years, also engaged in exhibitionism. And so he looked into windows, bathroom windows of neighbors as well, although he didn't get caught for that. And so you find out there may be a lot more. Again, there's kind of patterns, if you will, of sexual behavior where you have paraphilias operating where there may be more than one going on. And for example, Seligman and Hardenberg, in their 2000 article, state that mental disorders have been shown to occur with paraphilias, including, for example, depression, substance abuse, personality disorders, and anxiety disorders. Chantry and Craig, in their article, point out that sex offenders have higher rates of personality disorders. So we're going to see some of those situations occur as well. And of course, what I'm not covering here, but is also very relevant to our practice, investigations, and work today, would be online sexual deviations. And so that, of course, a whole nother area itself. So I'm going to wrap up with this video, and I'll have another video out on pedophilia. Thank you.